about halachas. For example, when we learn the Mishnayos is fundamentally a kind of a mini text book on all the halachas. So the Mishnayos is composed of 6 Sidorim, which compose all the various areas of halacha that comprise the Taryag mitzvahs. The Rebbe Shem is given us 630 mitzvahs, and he's given them each one of them in their details. And the Rebbe Shem says to each and every Jew, I want you to know the 613 commandments. And fundamentally, the yeshiva world is not really cognizant of that, because the yeshiva world has decided that what it will teach is one specific area and fundamentally ignore all the other areas. So this becomes a very serious problem, that people sit and learn halachas, and they learn mishnayos and so on and so forth, but they finish all the halachas of a specific area only a very little bit. So most people do not know what's called the Taryag mitzvahs, the 630 mitzvahs. And in the end, that's what the Rabbi Shem wants you to know. He wants to know you to know the information that's contained in the 630 mitzvahs. How much does he want you to know? Well, he wants you to know the fundamental details of the mitzvahs. He wants you to know, however, all the mitzvahs. He does not simply want you to know the halachas contained in a specific Gemara. So therefore, when you spend your time on a specific Gemara and you learn about the halachas in that Gemara, you're learning a small part of Shas. But the real question is, what does exactly the Rebbe Shem want you to know? What would he like to know about the halachas and so on? And therefore, what you have to realize, the halachas themselves, even though there are statements about what you're supposed to do, the halachas themselves have to be organized according to there are certain internal structure. In other words, what exactly is a halacha? For example, let's say in Kodshim, there's a certain halacha of a korban olah, and the Masechtas of the Mishnayos talk about, let's say, the korban olah. But what does the Rebbe Shem want you to know? He wants you to know what comprises a korban olah. In other words, in essence, what is the definition of a korban olah? So he wants you to understand that the definition of a korban olah is a series of actions done in the Beis Hamikdash and concerning itself with a certain korban and the various different activities which are necessary to perform what's called a korban olah. There were also other korbanos, like a korban chatas, and the Rebbe Shem says, I want you to know what a korban chatas is. In other words, exactly how do you perform a korban chatas? And in addition, he wants you to know how you perform a korban olah. So he wants you to have a general idea of all the korbanos. But what he wants you to know about these korbanos is that there's certain circumstances that generate an obligation to bring a certain korban. And he wants you to know also all the various different circumstances which force you to bring certain korbanos. And this is fundamentally what the halachas of Kodshim is. It contains many, many laws about the korbanos, why you bring them, how you bring them, where you bring them, and those specifically circumstances. But is that enough? Is that all he wants you to know? The different korbanos, for example, in Kodshim, and their circumstances? Not really. Because you see, the details of bringing korbanos are details which have a cause and effect relationship. And this is something that we don't think about. So, for example, the Torah says that a korban olah has certain avodos and so on. It has an avodah of, first of all, of sacrificing it, of shechting it. It has an avodah in the Beis Hamikdash in terms of the what's called the zrikas adam, where you take the blood from the animal into a cup and you scatter it on the Beis Hamikdash itself. You throw the blood on the Beis Hamikdash. And what the Torah says is that there are many details of this. There's certain ways that you splatter it. You can either throw the blood on the mizbeach, or you can pour the blood on the mizbeach. And so there's a very big difference in terms of the quantity and the activity and so on. But you have to realize when you have a halacha of what do you call it, of zrika, which is what it's called, there are many details of the zrika. And what you want to really know is what is the manifestation of the zrika, of spilling the blood on the mizbeach in terms of each korban. So that's what's called remembering the halachas. But the truth of the matter is, what God really wants us to know is something even deeper than that. In other words, He will tell us what the zrika is, but He will tell us that different korbanos have a different form of zrika. There's a different way you have to place the blood on the mizbeach. A korban olah has one type of zrika, a korban chatas has another type of zrika, a korban shlomim has a third type of zrika, and so on. But the question is, what determines exactly how you perform the zrika? In other words, there is another concept which actually determines how the zrika is done. And all we know that the zrika of a korban is done on the basis of a zrika. But what determines that? So therefore, in other words, all halachas are governed by other halachas, and so on. So even though the zrika will change depending on the korban, it changes according to the concept of the korban itself. There's something about a korban olah that demands a certain zrika, and there's something about a korban chatas that demands a certain zrika. What is that? Well, the Torah doesn't tell us, but that's actually what God wants us to know. What we see is the beginning of a certain law. What does that mean, a law? What is a law, really? A law is not so much what you do. A law is simply that you have to do something based on a certain concept. In other words, in one form of the concept, you have to perform a zrika in a certain way. And according to another form of the concept, you have to perform a zrika in a different way. What is that concept? Well, the Torah doesn't really tell you. But the Torah wants you to be able to determine that. And that's called understanding the essence of the law. A law concerns the halacha and what determines that halacha. And we really don't know the laws in this fashion. But it's a cause and effect relationship. Based on certain principles, the halacha will change accordingly. He wants us to know exactly how the halacha will change based on the principles in which governs it. So in many ways, these are similar to the laws of physics or the laws of reality. It's determined by the laws of nature. For example, there's a certain force in nature called gravity, and that's where two objects attract each other. Now, if you ask the question, what determines the force of attraction. What does that depend on? And that's a law. That depends on the nature of the matter or the nature of the mass. The greater the mass, let's say, for example, the greater the weight of the object, not really, but let's say that, the greater the force of gravity. So in this case, you have a certain understanding exactly of the law. What determines the amount of force of gravity? What determines of how strongly the attraction is to the gravitational force? So this is determined fundamentally by the quantity of matter or the amount of mass. So therefore, what we see is a certain relationship between two separate concepts. One is the concept, which is the cause concept, the amount of mass that an object has. And the force of gravity is dependent on the quantity of matter. That's a law. In other words, most of the time when we learn halacha, we really don't understand what it's connected to or what determines what it does. And this is very important because to truly understand a halacha, you have to understand exactly what governs the expression of the halacha. And if you really don't know it, you really have a hard time knowing where the halacha applies or when it applies and so on. So what the Torah really wants you to have is a much clearer perception of what's going on in the Taryag mitzvahs. All the mitzvahs are specifically events. They are an event. For example, Shabbos. Shabbos is an event. We say it's a halacha, but really it's an event. It's a certain event at certain days of the week that govern our behavior. And what we want to know is what determines these events. There's something specific that determines the malachas on Shabbos. What are they? We're really not clear on that. But that's how God wants us to know the Torah. He wants to know us all the halachas as events and what determines their nature and so on. And that's considered understanding the halacha itself. But nobody really learns like this. The purpose of most of learning is not to learn what the event is connected to, how what it's connected to, which is called the causal event, determines the nature of the consequence. So in many ways, we have to use a certain language to describe this relationship. The causative event, the event which determines the nature of the consequence that happens, that causative event is called an independent variable. It's a variable because the cause can change. It has different quantities or qualities that tell me what it is. And when that determines the halacha is called the dependent variable. In other words, the actual halacha that comes out, that's applicable, depends on the nature of the cause event. So really, in many ways, learning the halachas of the Torah is having a clear understanding of what controls what, and so on and so forth. And what controls that? Well, we say it's exeris hakosov. In other words, we don't understand the reason for the laws, but we can fundamentally understand what determines the actual laws themselves. So that requires a certain type of analysis, which is unfortunately not really done to determine the nature of the halachas. Now, what determines the nature of these events? What determines what event cause determines a consequence or result cause? And how does it cause it? So we understand, for example, in Taurus, that different types of entities emit a certain thing called tumah, and they emit this tumah in a certain way. So sometimes you can acquire a certain state of tumah or contamination, tumah, by touching the source. And when you touch the source, let's say a sheretz, a reptile, a certain reptile, when it dies, when death, it emits a state of tumah. And how does it emit it? It emits, you can get it by touching it. So you actually receive this thing called tumah, which is a certain state, by receiving when you touch the source or the reptile and so on. Sometimes it's not simply touching it, it's just carrying it. So that even if you don't touch the reptile, you can acquire the tumah by carrying the reptile. Other times you don't even have to carry anything. You simply go into the same area, the same atmosphere, the same area, and if you're in the area located with, let's say, a dead body transfers its tumah. It can transfer its tumah by touching or by carrying, but it can also transfer its tumah by simply being in the same room as a dead body. And this is critical. So we see that the transmission of tumah varies according to different halachas. But do we know why it varies? No. We have no idea why a reptile, a dead reptile, will transfer its tumah one way, and we don't know why a dead body will transfer its tumah another way, a completely different way. We have no knowledge. But the first task is to understand what's exactly related. What are the variables? What is the critical ideas that determine the halachas? Fundamentally, when we learn Torah, we don't learn this kind of information. We don't concern ourselves with the cause and effect of that of this halacha. We just know the various different instances where a certain type of source will transmit a certain type of tumah. But we really have no idea what about that source or why it transfers a certain type of tumah. For example, why doesn't a reptile transfer its tumah by being in the same area? It doesn't. If you're in the same room as a dead reptile, it cannot convey its tumah to you. You have to touch it for you to get the transmission. Why? We have no idea. So what we say is, well, whatever that's about, that God determined that this is what it's about. But fundamentally, you see, there's a certain way to learn to look at halachas. Because the halachas are really not behaviors. What they are is they are events. They are events that occur in the reality of life. And we know that certain events produce other events. Which events? We don't really know. Why these events produce these events? We also don't know. But really, the ultimate explanation for these events lie in understanding what exactly are the conditions in which these events occur. And unfortunately, to learn Torah that way is a completely different thing. We have to be able to know how to tie two halachas together so that we suddenly understand one halacha is the cause event of another halacha, which is the result event. That's one step. Now, for example, in the laws of mankind, there are certain behaviors. For example, there are certain events which are connected. For example, according to New York State law, the Penal Code, if you steal something from someone, what it says is that you will go to jail. they will give you a certain amount of time in jail for doing this event. So we see that the cause event of giving you time in jail is what? Is stealing. Stealing is an event which generates the consequence of going to jail. But what's the connection between the two? Well, the connection is arbitrary. So, in other words, they first have to catch you, they first have to convict you of the crime, and then you can go to jail. So, in other words, the connection between two events is initiated by an intermediary between people. The police have to become involved to connect the two events. So when the police catch you stealing, then they can say, well, now you have to go to jail. So the cohesive force that determines that has to do with the police. If the police don't catch you, then the event is not through. Even though you steal, you don't go to jail. Because in order for you to go to jail, you have to be caught. You have to go to court. You have to be convicted. So there's a series of events that must take place. This is an event caused or determined by mankind. How is it determined? By legislators, by lawyers, by politicians, and so on, who write the laws. And they say that one event will produce another event. But the intermediary is a person who has to connect the two. And if there's no connection by the police, nothing happens. You see, but the laws of nature are completely different. How is that? Because if you have two bodies, two astronomical bodies connected to each other, or you have two bodies which are in the same proximity, automatically what the universe says, one body will attract another body. Well, what does the attraction? Nobody knows. One mass will attract another mass automatically and intrinsically. That is a law. So the difference between a law of nature and a law of people is that a law of nature automatically affects each other. Two masses which are near each other in a certain way will attract each other with a certain force that they both generate. And they will attract each other, so they will pull each other together. That's a law of nature. The effect happens when the cause happens automatically. That's in the nature of reality. But the law, which is adjudicated by mankind, where if you steal, you will go to jail, that's not produced normally in terms of what happens. In order for that to be connected, those two events have to be connected by a third connecting event, who, if he doesn't exist, then the law doesn't apply. So all natural law submits to this equation where certain events are called cause events and certain events are called resulting events. And the connection between these two are automatic. And to truly understand events, you really have to understand what causes them. And when you understand what causes an event, we have said the word that we use to describe this understanding is called an explanation. When I say, what causes gravity? What causes gravity? And what does the force of gravity depend on? Well, you say the force of gravity is determined by two masses that have this similar proximity. One and the other, they influence each other. And therefore, I've explained the event. Just simply to know the cause event behind a resulting event is a way to be able to understand the event. So that's what science is. Science is an analysis of cause events and resulting events. It's an analysis, and that's called a law of science. Science describes exactly why things happen. but it doesn't know the reason for it, but it describes what must take place for something to happen. And it's the same thing with halachas. The truth is, halachas are also events. You see it. In other words, on the seventh day of the week, suddenly you're not allowed to do certain behaviors. What causes that? Well, what causes that is that it's suddenly the seventh day of the week. The seventh day of the week emits some kind of force that makes certain actions forbidden. Why does it forbidden? It doesn't really say. So to truly understand the halachas of the Taryag mitzvahs, you really have to understand what causes these things. And therefore you have to have a certain clarity between events in terms of what the cause is and what the result is. And then it's said that you have a certain clarity of what these are. Now that's a very different way of learning Torah than what we generally do in Gemara. Because in Gemara we simply want to understand who says what and where does something come from. In other words, where are the halachas written and how do we know them? And we determine who the author is. But what we don't do is to understand what causes them, what makes them to be where they are. We really don't understand that. We simply list the series of causes and list a series of events, but we really have no grasp at all of the connection of these things. But just as science studies natural law, it studies the behavior of what? Of reality, of objects, forces, energy, and it discusses what exactly causes what. So therefore, when we understand the laws of gravity, we're asking the question, what causes the force of gravity? And how much of a certain cause has to be existing to determine a certain amount of effect? So scientists understand reality through what's called laws. And a law is the determination where one event causes another event. And that's what science is based. It's based on the study of the laws of nature. You see it. Torah also is a certain laws of nature, except it's not physical natures. The laws of Torah, for example, that the seventh day creates a situation where suddenly, what? Suddenly you're not allowed to do certain things. We don't understand why this happens, but that's what it is. But we really do not understand the aspect of its causation at all. We just memorize exactly what's going on. We have no real understanding of why it's going on. So we don't seek to explain our halachas. So this is the concept of Taryag mitzvahs. We really never understand why these laws, why there are these causes and these effects. We only simply memorize what happens, not why it happens. It means to what event is it connected to so that the resulting event will happen. So this is a certain different way of learning. And that different way of learning can be conducted by a certain methodology that will allow you to understand the origin of each halacha in terms of its cause and how the cause changes to produce a different result in the halacha. So we see exactly the way one cause moves and changes, and the result, how the result changes, and so on. That's truly understanding how one event controls another event. There's also another concept that's very important, which is fundamentally totally ignored. And I compare this event to a jigsaw puzzle. What exactly is a jigsaw puzzle? Well, it's a situation where you have certain things and so on. Certain pieces. Each piece is a portion of the picture. Let's say a jigsaw puzzle has 1,000 pieces. So you're supposed to take these pieces and arrange them in a certain order, which produces a picture. So we see that there are two different elements in any particular type of wisdom. There are the pieces, and then there's the picture. So fundamentally, you have to organize all the pieces to determine what the picture is. And if you don't know how to organize different details, you never get the picture. So therefore, it's like a jigsaw puzzle which does not have the picture on the outside of the box. What a jigsaw puzzle tells you, if you put all these pieces together in a certain order, you will get the totality of the picture. And you will suddenly see not pieces, not individual pieces, but suddenly you will see a picture that they all form. And that's what you really want. You want to know the relationship of each piece to the other one so that when they're put together, they form a picture. So the jigsaw puzzle has to do that. What it does is it presents all the different pieces and then it tells you what the pieces are like when they're all together in one different picture. So what you see is another concept. It says in the concept of geometry that the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. I don't know if you've heard that, but that's what you learn in geometry. The whole is equal to the sum of its parts. But that's not really true. It's not equal to the all the parts coming together. Because when you see the whole, you realize that the picture is not the same as all the pieces together. When you put pieces together and you arrange it in a certain way, you create a whole from the pieces. But the whole looks different. In other words, you cannot imagine what the whole picture looks like just by seeing all the pieces. So, in a certain sense, the picture which results from each of these pieces coming together in a certain way is even more or greater than the sum total of the pieces. What's very critical is that the information contained in a certain subject matter, for example, in the subject matter called physics, it's composed of many different details. But physics is not only about the details, it's about the details coming together, forming a total picture. And the picture is different than simply the sum of the details. But if you just simply have the details, would you say that you have the correct information? No, you understand that if all you have is 1,000 separate individual pieces of a puzzle, you don't know the whole puzzle as it exists together. And it exists together as a picture. So therefore, we see that all information exists in two states. They exist as a series of individual facts, which are like pieces, and then they also exist as a unit, as a gross unit together, and they form a certain picture together. And both of these elements are critical in understanding a certain wisdom. So, therefore, we see something amazing that there are two elements that are part of your understanding. You have to learn each of the pieces, first of all, and these are simply pieces, fragments of the total thing. But there's also the concept where all the pieces come together and they form a total picture. And suddenly you see something else that you cannot see from the individual pieces. Well, how do you do that? If I give you 1,000 facts in a subject Can you put them all together and come out with the final picture? And that's called a structure. So the structure of a chokhmah is composed of two things. It's composed of all the pieces, and it's composed of all the pieces coming together so that it forms the picture. But how do you do that? You have to know how to do that, because rarely are you presented with the picture. Whenever you study something like mathematics or science or Torah, whenever you study, for example, the halachas of kachim, you have a lot of pieces. Those pieces are individual laws. These would include types of kabbanas, why you bring the kabbanas, how you bring the kabbanas, and all the details. But kachim is also the combination of all these pieces together as some kind of whole. In other words, the question that you would question about the whole is, what is a korban? What exactly is a korban? So you really don't know what a korban is from studying the details of the laws of kachim. You only know what a korban is when you see the totality, where all the specific fragments come together and suddenly form a single entity, which is the combination of all of them. And that begins to tell you what you're actually looking at. So, in other words, when we learn something, we understand that learning of something is never complete until we both have all the pieces and how the pieces come together to form the final picture. But it is the final picture which actually tells us what we're building. It's the same thing with a building. There are two elements in architecture of a building. The first element are the pieces of the building. What? The beams. Every building has beams. Beams hold up the building. It has wiring. It has plumbing, pipes. You see. So it has a lot of different things. It has bricks. A building is composed of a number of different building materials and so on. But the materials of a building is not the building. The building is the whole coming together, where all the bricks come together with all the wiring, with all the plumbing, and all the beams. They came together to form one specific unit or one design. And that's the picture of the whole building. But the picture of a building is completely unlike the picture of each particular fragment. But it's both of these elements that are critical to understand a building, to know what it is. Because what you want to know about a building, why was it built? For what purpose? What is it supposed to do? Is the building a stadium, or is the building a rental where people live in? Is it a residence? Is it a stadium? And so on. Is it a bank? Is it an airport? Different buildings, or the totality of a building, represents a different function for the building. You cannot know what the function of a building is as long as you are confined to the parts. So just like in architecture, where there are separate diagrams for each particular part, but somehow all these diagrams come together at the end to form a picture of the entire building. And it's only the picture of the entire building that finally tells you what it's all about. So that's also an item which has two structural features: details and the general picture. So therefore, when you are studying a subject, you're studying both of these elements. You're studying, first of all the details. And the second thing is saying, if I put all these details together, what does it look like in the end? What does the totality of all the specific fragments look like? That's why really wisdom only comes when you both study details and you study the totality of it all. But somehow we don't realize that. Why? Because we never really get to the totality. Yes, an architect will get to the totality. He knows that you have to have a knowledge of all the fragments of a building, the beams, the wiring, the plumbing, and so on, the bricks. He knows that the building is composed of thousands of small items, but he also knows that they all have to come together to form a total picture. He knows that only both of those knowledge, the knowledge of both, will tell you exactly what it is. And it's the same thing with all wisdom. Every chokhmah, whether it's mathematics or science or halachas, no matter what it is, they're all composed of the same kind of structure, where you have what's called fragmented halachas. These are specific halachas, and you also have, at the same time, the totality when all the pieces come together, and suddenly you see the picture of the whole thing, which is different than the picture of each fragment. So the problem with Torah is that when you learn Torah, you're always learning the details. You never put together the details to form the picture. So if I ask you, what's the picture of Kachim, of all the korbanos, when they are all together? What is a korban? What are different types of korbanos? What's the purpose of a korban? You really can't answer that until you put together all the halachas of the different korbanos. So in other words, there are two types of study: the study of fragments and the study of of what the total picture looks like. And you have to know how to go from one to the other with a certain ease. And that has to do with a certain methodology. There is a certain methodology which prepares you for that particular type of activity. There's a methodology which allows you to examine fragments thoroughly in themselves. But there's another method which allows you to put fragments together and suddenly understand the totality of all of the fragments together. So the question is, what do you do first? Do you study the details or do you study the whole picture? Well, in order to have the picture, you have to put together the details. So there's no picture without the details. But once you have all the details, then you have to put together the details themselves to tell you what the whole picture is. And the fact is, nobody does that. In Torah learning, no one really does that. No one takes all the halachas individually and in the end puts them all together. So no one does this to Kachim. No one does this to what? To the halachas of Taurus or Zeroyim or anything. In the end, you want to have a picture of Zeroyim. What is Zeroyim? Well, we talk about specific Zeroyim. We talk about Peah, and so we talk about Shemitah. We talk about many different halachas in Zeroyim. But what's the total picture of it all when it all comes together in one big picture? So you don't even understand what I'm talking about. It doesn't make sense because you say, well, each fragment is its own picture. No, it's not. Fragments come together as a unity. And as a unity, it forms a gradual graphic that's not visible from the individual things. So that you have to learn a method to do that. There's a specific methodology that allows you to do that. And until you do that, you're missing information. You're missing understanding. You really never grasp what the Torah is telling you in its entirety. So this is a big chasson. So what we do is we have a certain methodology which allows us to do both of these elements. It allows us to put fragments together and allows us to see the totality of it and what the picture looks like as a whole. So this is an analysis of structure. There's a certain thing called the structure of Seder. Kachim, with all its thousands of halachas, has a structure in the picture. We never see that. We don't even know what that is. So fundamentally, you don't even know what I'm talking about. What does that mean? That kachum has a structure. Simply, kachum is this full total of all the halachas individually. That's what you think. So each Mishnah lives on its own. Each Mishnah in a Masechta is a separate entity which lives by itself. You know, it's like having a list of people and where they live. Each person lives at a certain address. And when you know the address, you know where the person lives. But the address of where people live is not the city. That's not the city. And a map is a city. So, in other words, what you see is there's a tremendous disadvantage by never seeing the full picture. Because there's another question that we ask. If I say to you, uh, if I say to you, I tell you how to get to Chicago. Let's say you want to go to city, from New York City to Chicago, and you've never gone from New York City to Chicago. So you have no idea how to get from one place to another. What do you have to use to be able to do that? Well, the answer is a map. Well, what is a map? How, if you use a map, did that guide you how to go from New York City to Chicago? How does a map do that? All a map is a piece of paper with a bunch of diagrams of roads. So how does that inform you how to do it? Well, because what it does, it says to go from one city to another, you have to use a series of roads. And therefore, what you have to know is the sequence of all the roads that go from New York City to Chicago. So therefore, you can go from New York City to Chicago, even though you've never gone there, by simply looking at a map. So therefore, you know how to navigate the reality of going from one city to another, even though you've never done that. And you probably have to go through 100 different roads to do that. How do you do that? Because a map is a diagram of the relationship of each road to the other. So it gives you a complete sequence of exactly how to get from one city to another because you know the sequence. First, you have to go by this road. Then this road will take you to another road. And that road will take you a third road. So each road is seen in a certain sequence of the one before it and the one after it, so that you know the relationship of all the roads that go between New York City and Chicago, even though you've never gone. So that's a question of what it means to study the picture. If you study each road individually, all you have is a knowledge of roads. But when you study the sequence of roads, which road follows which road exactly, and where do you go with each change of direction, then suddenly you don't have a picture of a road, you have a picture of a route. Route, a route. You know the route. What is even a route? A route is the knowledge of each specific road in its sequence with all other roads in a certain direction to get you somewhere. Well, that's what a picture is. A picture is a knowledge of the whole thing. It's not a knowledge of each individual road by itself. It's a knowledge of how all the roads are coordinated. So, therefore, a map is a structural diagram. It tells you relationships between fragments, relationships between roads. It doesn't tell you about a specific road itself. It tells you the relationships of all roads to each other in a certain sequence. So if I have a map of America, exactly, I can go anywhere in America, even though I've never been anywhere in America, which is really not true. You see what I'm saying? But how do you do that? Because suddenly you're able to take all the fragments, the road fragments, and see their relationship. So, in other words, the amazing thing is that when you study a subject like Kachum, you're studying details, thousands of details. But what happens is when you study the relationship of those details to each other, you begin to have a sense of the totality of the Chokhmah. And this can all be done through a certain methodology. It's never done. because people don't realize that that's what invades a certain wisdom, that there's a totality in every wisdom. There's a totality of physics, electrical energy. It's related to acoustic energy. That's related to atomic energy, the magnetic energy. So therefore, all energies are interrelated in some way. And when I see the relationship of all different energies, I get a certain sense of the totality of the picture called physics. When I only study one piece of physics, like electrical energy, I only see electrical energy. I don't see its connection or its relationship to anything else. I just have a knowledge of fragments. And that's a knowledge of the details. But when I put it all together, I form what's called a picture, a unified picture of all the fragments as they relate to each other. And that's above and beyond the details themselves. So that's what you have to realize, what you fundamentally don't realize, that a chokhmah, a wisdom, a thought process, a science, does never appears as a series of fragments. That's only one aspect of it. But ultimately, that chokhmah will reveal to you the relationship of all the facts to each other. It's like you have a map of a city. You know where everyone lives individually. You know the specific address in which he lives, but you also know where that address relates to another address. So therefore, you know the address of everyone on the block. Well, then you know not simply an address, you know a street. You know the full street and all the people who live on that street, because what you know is the details and the relationship of every address to every other address. That is the knowledge of a picture. That's called a structural view. The structural view is to be able to see all details in terms of the total picture in which it represents. And if you are lacking that picture, you never really understand what's going on. Unfortunately, nobody really learns like this. Nobody learns with fragment picture. They don't understand that they're the two separate components of the totality of wisdom. So therefore, the knowledge of most of Torah is really simply a collection of facts. So therefore, you know how they judge an Eloi. An Eloi is called a genius. That's in Hebrew. What is an Eloi? A person has a photographic memory. He's said to be a genius. Why? Because he remembers every fact, which of course is incredible. But even though he knows every fact, that doesn't mean he knows anything, because he does not know how the facts come together and produce a picture. So therefore, he is lacking in wisdom. That's why a person with a photographic memory is not really a genius. He just has a photographic genius, but he doesn't necessarily understand things in a better way. So therefore, what you have to do is you have to learn, how do I do that? How do I accumulate different pictures, different fragments into a complete picture? So suddenly I see an aspect which I didn't see before. I see how all the individual pieces come together to form a totality of wisdom. And what you see in the totality of the picture, you do not see in each individual fact. Just like when you see a building as a totality, you don't see all the individual pieces. The pieces of a building or the fragments of a building or the construction of a building is based on the details of the building. But the actual picture of the building, the use of the building, depends on what? Depends on when they all come together. So therefore, you have to have a special methodology to be able to attack both elements of this. And this has to be taught. Unfortunately, it's not taught at all in the yeshiva world. They're always stuck on the facts, the details, and they never really ever get to the picture, the totality. So that's something that I think I can teach you, the method in which to go from fragments to a picture. And therefore you will have a completely different version of the wisdom that you seek. You cannot compare the knowledge of Kachum when you see it in terms of its thousands of facts and when you see it as an entirety of a picture, all related to each other. What a korban is, the definition of a korban, all the different types of korbanos, why you bring a korban. You have to see the totality of all of it in front of you to understand what you're looking at. And by simply looking at individual halachas, even though you look at them and you understand them, when you only look at each individual halacha, you are extremely limited in what you know and what you see. So that's the concept of structure. And the method which I want to present to you is how do you do that? In other words, if you don't have a picture, let's say all you have is 1,000 pieces. That's right. You have a jigsaw puzzle of 1,000 pieces, but you don't know what the picture looks like because there is no picture on the box. Can you put it together? No. If you don't have a picture on the box, what they all look like when they're together, you really can't put it together by the fragments. But there's a way to do that. There's a way to always form the picture from the individual facts. But you have to know exactly how it's constructed in that way. So therefore, there's a lot about thinking that people don't know. People don't really know how to think because they don't know what the goal is, what they want to know in the end. And what they want to know in the end is the wisdom itself, the relationship. When you want to learn physics, you want to know the relationship of electrical energy to mechanical energy to sound energy and so on to nuclear energy. So you want to know exactly how they all fit together, and they simply may be some aggravated forms of each other. They could be special cases of general energy. You'll never see it because you'll never put it together and see what the final picture looks like. So what I can offer you is to teach you how to do this. And we would learn by learning the Mishnayos, by learning each Mishnah individually and understanding how to analyze it. So what we have a goal. The goal is not to be simply stuck with the individual shot in the Mishnayos, but the goal is to understand how the Mishnah fits with all the other Mishnahs of the Perek, and then how the Mishnahs of the Perek, of Perek 1, fit with the Mishnah of Perek 2 and 3 and 4. And finally, you have a totality of all of them together. So you learn the whole thing. You learn the whole picture. You know how to go from the fragment to the picture and accumulate all of that. So this is the methodology that I want to teach. And if you're interested in learning this, Mayor Jacobson, who kind of is taking charge of the thing, you have to contact him, and he will tell you some of the rules. How often we'll do the shiur, probably once a week for an hour, and gradually I will tell you precisely how to go about doing it, how to, from an address book, how to form a map of a city and a map of the country. In other words, how to go from one level of totality to another level of totality. So he will be in touch with all of you that I hope listen to this and that know exactly what I want to achieve. And you'll decide if this information is valuable for you, and it will increase your depth, because depth, which is to understand the details, can only be achieved after you've gotten the picture. And when it all comes together as a whole, that's when you really say, you know Kachum, you know Taurus, you know Zruim. So this is what I'd like to do. You're all invited to participate and so on. So Mayor Jacobson will be in touch with you all. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you. Be in touch on the WhatsApp group if you need any questions or anything like that. If you have any questions.
What's the website?
No, there's no website. I'll put the YouTube channel if you guys want to listen to that.
Okay.
It gives us a lot to think about, Rabbi.
It gives us a lot, and it takes effort. It doesn't come automatically. If you don't learn the method itself, how to do it, you're stuck with details for the rest of your life.